back. Awesome. Are you there?
Yes.
Awesome. So we're live. And if you guys, I want to have some time for people to kind of jump on just for a little bit. But in the meantime, if you guys are just joining us, just catching on, please share this link and spread it around. Tag someone if you're on Facebook. For those who are hopping on from the YouTube live stream, please share away because it's been a while since I've done an episode. Work has been kicking my butt. But this one has been a long time coming. Onleilove. We've been trying to do this for like
Yeah.
almost like 6 months almost. When was the
Yes.
Metro Hope?
It's even from my end.
Oh yeah, well you're traveling all over the country in parts of Africa, so we'll talk about that. But yeah, you're the world traveler over here, so I wanted to accommodate you. Where are you coming from just recently?
On Sunday I got back from Ghana, West Africa.
And then before that, did you stay in Ghana the whole time, the whole trip, or was you jump around a little bit?
No, I had a forced period of time in Morocco due to the to Royal Air Morocco, but they did put us in a nice hotel, and I
Okay,
was able to go around Casablanca, so I can't really complain.
that's nice.
Then I spent a few weeks in Ghana traveling to different regions to visit Hebrew congregations. And then I went for 2 weeks to Nigeria to help launch something called the Joseph Project. And then I was back in Ghana. So it was mostly Ghana, though.
So pretty productive then, I guess you can say.
Yes. Pack time. Now I'm readjusting to America.
Mm.
It's a lot different.
Yeah, you're coming in a crazy time too.
Yeah.
Well, it's always a crazy time, right, with everything that's going on, and we'll definitely jump into that. But if you guys are just joining us, I'm with Onleilove Alston. She has a master's in divinity and also MSW, and the founder of Prophetic Whirlwind, Uncovering the Black Biblical Destiny, a teaching ministry. Excuse me, a teaching ministry dedicated to uncovering the black roots of the Bible while inspiring cultural pride, justice, and gender equality rooted in a Hebraic understanding of the scriptures. A native New Yorker, community organizer, consultant, speaker, and writer, Onleilove worships at, I might butcher this pronunciation, as Bethel, House of Yahweh. Is that
You
right?
got it right.
All
Yeah.
right, cool. In the South Bronx. And her first book, Prophetic Whirlwind, Uncovering the Black Biblical Destiny, will be published in 2018. And you guys can follow her at Prophetic Whirl on Twitter. So, as you guys know, this is the first time you're hearing me. My name is Joel Lopez. The Q2 podcast host. The Q2 podcast is sponsored by PanVisio, which is pretty much a tech consulting group that really believes in aiming the technology towards social change. And so we like to say when tech and social justice collide, that's where PanVisio really lives and thrives. And so this podcast is really dedicated to highlighting not just thought leaders, but people who are in the front lines of this change, whether it's faith justice or just straight up political policy, anything that's kind of moving our society forward to make a better world. And so it's, like I said earlier when we opened up, it's been a while because, you've been traveling and things have been kind of crazy on my end too. But Onleilove, we connected at Metro Hope years ago. We had a reunion service. We connected there. I would love to hear a little bit about, before we get into what you're all about, how you came in your faith journey to where you are now doing this kind of work. I'm really interested in how that came about.
So when I was about 7 years old, my stepfather lost his job, and my family lost our house in Queens. And within a year, my little brother and I were taken into the foster care system just due to poverty, not really due to abuse or anything like that, which is why I have a lot of empathy for the immigrant kids that are being separated from their parents. What many people don't know is that in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, millions of black children were wrongly separated from their families. Malcolm X's brother actually headed up the administration of children's services in New York, because when you read Malcolm X's biography, his family was taken into the foster care system. So, his brother fought one type of fight, and,
Mm.
he fought another type of fight for kids. So we really, really need to keep these kids in our thoughts and prayers and step up in any way we can. And so I found myself an orphan, and thankfully my grandmother and aunt got us out of traditional foster care into kinship foster care. But I wasn't, my parents weren't religious, my father wasn't religious, my stepfather wasn't religious, my mom wasn't religious. No religion was really pushed on me. My grandmother believes in God, but she stopped going to church a long time ago. So I was 10, and for whatever reason, I felt led to read the Bible and pray morning, noon, and night. And I did that for about 4 years. I started reading the Psalms first. And then one day, my Aunt Frida looked at me and she said, "Somebody needs to take this girl to church." And so I, at 14, kind of made a deal with the Most High, like, I'll go to church 2 times a month, but I'm not going to get saved because that's for old people. I'll do that. When I was like 14, I thought 28 was old, and I'm not 28 anymore. But I made some type of deal, like, I'll get saved when I'm 28, but I won't do that now. Now, I didn't know what being saved or born again meant. I didn't have, I don't even know, I just heard that term being thrown around in the Black community. But the first Sunday I went to church, it was a Greater Bright Light Missionary Baptist Church in East New York, Brooklyn. That's where I spent most of my childhood, in Pink Houses Projects. And like all Baptist ministers, Reverend Chapman, who's since passed on, gave an altar call, and I went up and I accepted Yahshua, better known as Jesus, as my savior. And I always say that day, it wasn't just my soul that was saved from an afterlife of hell, but it was my spirit, soul, and body that was being saved from everything that I had
Mm.
gone through. And so I really ate up the Bible, tried to study. I, became born again on a Sunday. I was baptized on Tuesday. I had my first communion the next Sunday. And I was always interested by the Sabbath, but one of my Sunday school teachers told me, "Oh, it's not that serious." But one thing is, I really wanted to study the word, because when I encountered Yahshua, it was like a life altering experience. It wasn't religion, it wasn't games, it wasn't something my parents made me do. It was really life altering. And so
Mm.
I'm always like, I know that, the God of the Bible is the God of the orphan and the widow, because when I was an orphan, he saved me. That's not just something I say
Wow.
because I do faith justice work. It's something I say because it's the life I live. And now, all of my siblings, on my mom's side, have accepted Yeshua at different times. So that was really my faith journey. I was in the Seekers Club in high school under Urban Youth Alliance. Anybody from New York who's a Christian of a certain age will know
Yeah, even
those.
I heard about that movement. Like they ran heavy back then. Ruben
Yes,
was telling me about them. They
yes.
they did their thing.
Yeah, and with a lot of Black, Latino, and Asian students leading the way. I went to Penn State University and I joined the Navigator Christian Fellowship. So most of my friends were in InterVarsity, but because I was at a football school, I thought InterVarsity was for football players. I thought it was where Christian football players and athletes studied. And
Hmm.
I'm like, okay, that's cool for them. So I joined the Navigators, which shocks people when if navigators. But the thing I liked about the navigators is it was really about being thoughtful about your faith, really studying the word. But I began to encounter like the white evangelical movement through radio. I was recruited by Liberty College through, being at college and having hate crimes happen on my campus, and really very few Christians of any race having a, a, a answer to give for how
Yeah.
we reconcile our faith with our race. And I actually, when I was at Penn State, a Black man was killed.
Wow.
His body, there was a letter written to Black Caucus, to my friends, about where he was buried. And while you guys were marching, we killed one of you. When the school finally drug their feet to find him, they did find a black man who was traveling from New York City. And so, seeing all of that, seeing friends and football players get death threats, seeing what later came out about Penn State, but people not knowing that, Penn State also covered up a lot of hate crimes. I really almost had a crisis of faith in college where I said, my issue is not with you, Yeshua. I know you're real. I know the Bible is real, but if your people don't have anything to say about injustice, racism, maybe this is not the place for me. And I almost walked away from the faith, but I felt, the Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh in Hebrew really tell me this is not the faith. This is a perversion of it. Please don't leave. And then a few months later, I took an African American religious studies course because all the black kids at Penn State took it. Even kids who weren't religious, even atheist kids. Even I had a friend who grew up a black Jew. He took it. Like everyone just took it. And when we had to read God of the Oppressed by the late Dr. James Cone, who I was able to take his classes at Union, for the first time I saw the Bible in my experience. I saw my experience in the Bible. I mean, in a very real way. And when I read Isaiah 61 about, the poor hearing the good news and rebuilding the ruined cities, I said, well, I come from East New York. Our city is pretty ruined, but I'm also hearing the good news as a poor person. Maybe this good news can give me the power to help rebuild my city. And so that's a little bit of my faith journey. I can talk a little bit about how I came into Torah and into being a Messianic Hebrew, but that's basically, my faith and how, I was just drawn. No one forced me, you know, into being a follower of the scriptures.
That's incredible. And so for you, your transition to be a messianic, I guess how would you term your as much as we hate labels, yada yada yada. Like, how would
Yeah,
you describe where how you are? Because there's
yeah.
I've been doing some research. I don't know your. It sounds like from my research on your background, it was like a thread for you. Like it wasn't just like you
hmm
stopped here and then you became, a Hebrew Messianic Jew here. Like what was that transition like? It seems like it was like a subtle, like layered.
Yeah. Yeah, and my whole faith journey just has been, I feel, you know, our Father just taking me into more truth. I identify as a Messianic Hebrew now, and that's really Hebrew is a term for the people who descend from the people, the Hebrews of the Bible. Many Americans use the term Jew, but what we don't realize is Jew is kind of shorthand or slang for Ju- the people from the tribe of Judah, but there were 12 tribes of Israel. And Jew also in America is highly associated with white people, whereas in other countries, it may be associated with, if you go to Portugal, it'll be associated with people that look Latino. You go to Nigeria, it's going to be associated with Africans. You go to certain parts of Israel with Mizrahi Jews, which are Paula Abdul's people. Everyone thought she was black, but she's actually an original, inhabitant of the Middle East, is going to be associated with people who look Middle Eastern. And so I use the term Hebrew because I don't want to leave out anyone from any of the 12 tribes. But the way I transitioned into that is, I went to seminary. I really got to study the word, not just based on my emotion, not just based on what someone else told me, but based on what was actually in the scriptures. And I went to Union Seminary, and everyone's like, "Oh, that's such a liberal place," but it's like any place. You if God means for you to be there, you're going to learn something from it. And so at the end of seminary, I was really struggling with what I read in the Bible and what I saw practiced at a lot of churches. Now, one thing that I learned at Metro Hope that really, I guess, radicalized my faith was the importance of community. Because when I was in the evangelical movement, it was all about your personal relationship with God. And I could never be okay being personally saved, but knowing my friends in East New York were perishing, or looking at the rest of my family who's owned by the largest slaveholding family in America, and seeing all of the generational patterns and curses. I never felt comfortable with the singular salvation.
Yeah.
And so when under Pastor Jose, where we met, the idea of community and communal salvation, and you can't just be a lone ranger, that was another like transition and aha moment where I realized my salvation wasn't just about me, but about a whole people. And so I started in 2012 to really research the Sabbath, because that was always something I wanted to do but was discouraged from doing. But because I was doing so much faith-based organizing, my health, my work habits were really getting out of control. And because I grew up in New York, I thought that it was normal to always be working, because all the adults around me, that's what I saw. And so Sabbath really saved me in a lot of ways so I
Hmm.
could continue to do the justice work. And I did a 2-week fast around Easter, around Passover. And I really fasted about, the identity of the biblical Hebrews. Should I be following Torah? And so when I say Messianic Hebrew, it's just it's someone who believes in Yahshua or Jesus as the Messiah, but they still keep the Sabbath, keep the biblical feast. And the early church, for the first 300 years, even the apostle Paul was still going to the synagogue on Sabbath, and then still working with the assemblies, the new assemblies that were being planted that followed Messiah. Yahshua would, all those times when he's turning over the tables at the temple and he's beefing with the Pharisees, or he's having the Last Supper, Yahshua was actually in the temple
Hmm.
because he was going to worship there. The Last Supper it was basically a Passover Seder. Or when a rabbi teaches his students, at the end of the teaching, he has a banquet for them. So Yahshua basically is having like a Passover like banquet, almost graduation for his disciples. Usually when you eat as a Hebrew, back then you would wash your hands, but Yahshua took it to another level and washed their feet to humble himself. So we forget that Yahshua was born a color. He was born in a body. He was born to a family. He wasn't just this like cartoon character out of nowhere. And we can't say who he was wasn't important, because if it wasn't important, then his father wouldn't have made him incarnate at a certain time
Yeah.
in a certain place. So I wanted to know more about the culture of the person I follow. How can you say, "Oh, I'll die for Jesus. I'll go to the end of the earth for Jesus," but you don't even really know who he is? You don't even really know the name that would have been on his birth certificate. It's like when we're dating someone, we want to know everything about them, everything about their parents, but when it comes to Yahshua, it's kind of like we really don't want to know everything about him. We just want him to be the person that saves us, with no respect to his culture. And so I began, at the end of the fast, I felt led to and had a confirmation that I should go this way. And many years I looked for a congregation. Now, just some terms, for your audience.
Yeah.
Some people might hear of African Jews like the Ethiopians or the Igbo of Nigeria, or they may hear terms like Black Hebrew Israelite, um, and just like in Christianity, there's different denominations, different churches, different fellowships, different doctrines, debates over doctrines. So I'm going to explain a little bit some of the history. When I do work in Africa, I'm working with African Hebrew communities. They may be called African Jewish communities, or by the Jewish community, they may be called lost tribe communities. When you look in your Bible, there was a period where the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom broke apart. There's 12 tribes of Israel. Judah, Benjamin, and Levi kind of stayed together. They were on the scene still when Yahshua came. But the 10 tribes, Ephraim, Naphtali, Zebulon, Simeon, those people, they were carried off into Assyrian captivity. Captivity is not slavery. Captivity is when you're not completely free, but you're not completely a slave. So, millions of African Americans were brought to America. We're not in Africa. We never really were given, there was no formal citizenship process for African Americans. We never got sworn in. Nobody in my family who was taken from
Hmm.
Nigeria ever got sworn in. We're kind of de facto citizens, but we don't have our language, we don't have our culture, we're not in our homeland. We didn't choose to come here. We're kind of like in a state of captivity. And so when the tribes went into Assyria, the Assyrian Empire eventually fell, and they scattered in many different places in Africa, India, Asia, and theologians have this term, lost tribes of Israel. But God never can really lose people. And so there are prophecies that the closer we get to the return of the Messiah, or for people who don't believe that Yeshua is the Messiah, they would say the closer we get to the Messiah coming, these tribes will start waking up and coming back. And so in 2013, I watched a documentary called Reemerging the Jews of Nigeria at the Ethiopian Jewish Film Festival here in New York, and it was about the Igbo of Nigeria, who have about 30 million people in Nigeria. But what most people don't know is they lost some of the highest numbers to the transatlantic slave trade. So about 1 in 4 Black Americans have Igbo ancestry, and about 65% of Jamaicans. And there are many groups like this, but the Igbo have more so than some others have held on to the fact that they descend from the tribe of Gad under his son Eri. You can turn to Genesis 46 and read about Gad and his sons and the one named Eri. And I was able to meet a king who is also Messianic Hebrew, but he very much believes in Yeshua. But he literally descends from Eri in the Bible. Like he has all of his patriarchs from Eri, how they migrated to Nigeria to him. And today he's known as Eze Eri. Eze is kind of an Igbo word for king, even though they're very democratic. So they like to say we don't have kings. They have people that act like kings.
Hmm.
And I was able to meet with him, and he comes here for a festival in Virginia, and he lays hands on African Americans, and he prays for the curses of slavery to be broken off
Hmm.
of us. And his wife, he has a Messianic Hebrew congregation on his compound, but he works with people of Igbo descent of all religions because he's representing everyone. But he actually prayed for me. And I mean, I saw, we had the Bible, and this man can literally trace himself back to someone in the Bible. And
Yeah.
so there are these people that exist, and many times as believers, you have to fight for the validity of the Bible. But there are the Dahomey tribe in Benin, who the women warriors of Black Panther were based off. Their women warriors, they actually had a temple that that anthropologists wrote about. And in this temple, they had the Ten Commandments and even pieces of some of the Torah. I mean, the things that I've learned doing 5 years of research for my book will almost blow you away.
Hmm.
Like DNA testing that was done by a university in Russia and published by Haaretz, one of the top Israeli newspapers, that they took two skulls from Judea 2,000 years ago, Judea where Yeshua is from, and they studied the skulls and the DNA, and they said the skulls looked Black African, and
Hmm.
that the woman looked even more Black African than the man. And so sometimes people say, "Oh, well, the biblical Hebrews were olive color," but there's no people who are green. Unless
Hmm.
you, I mean, some things it sounds like it makes sense, but it doesn't. And most Jewish people that I know that I worked with as a faith organizer, most Jewish rabbis, they know about these groups. Christians, this may be mind blowing. Oh, Jews in Africa. Oh, no. But in the 1800s, Africans were writing letters to rabbis in England saying, we're lost tribes, come and get us. And there are some Jewish people who are older who they have organizations dedicated to finding these people. And so, when I started to research and even look into my own family, how we were taken from Nigeria, in this November, I went to Nigeria and I was welcomed back, like elders crying, because when they took the slaves away, they say these people will never see Nigeria again.
Mm.
So when I walked through one of those Igbo villages that lost the most people to slavery, people were literally coming out of their house. Elder men were crying, and the whole town, including the local Eze, had a welcome party for me. And they were, because they were told, you will never see these people again. And many of these people, they said, oh, we know we're one of the lost tribes of Israel. And some people don't even like the term lost because, again,
Yeah.
God can't lose people. But when Yahshua came, he said, I'm coming for the lost sheep of Israel. So, what happened for the world is, through Yahshua's death, burial, and resurrection, to redeem his own blood, brothers and sisters, and now opens the gates for everyone to connect with God and be saved. But if we don't know who these people are, or maybe even people who say they believe the Bible may not fully believe that the people in the Bible actually existed, we're going to be lost when it comes to prophecy. What is salvation? What is redemption? Because there's the singular salvation and then there's also the collective salvation of whole people groups. And so for me, I know when people Google like Hebrew Israelites, you may find some weird groups, some cultish groups. My congregation is 65 years old, was started by an African American Pentecostal woman. Her grandson leads it now. We have a justice ministry called Inner City Lighthouse. We feed 200 mostly Latino immigrants every Shabbat, and have a prayer service for them through our feeding program. We preach salvation, we preach getting baptized, we preach being a disciple, but we keep, the biblical feasts, and we do preach that the Hebrews were black people and are. Now, when we use these terms black and African, they're not in the Bible. I name my ministry, Uncovering the Black Biblical Destiny, because most people know black. But in the Bible, you don't read these racial categories that are only about 500 years old, but you read about tribes of people.
Hmm.
Edomites, Hebrews, Canaanites. Canaanites still exist. They live in Israel. They're black people. They're actually very good looking. I know why in the Bible a lot of the Hebrew men went to the women. They're still there. They still practice their Canaanite religion. Samaritans still live in Israel. They're still a kind of biracial people. And actually, their numbers are dwindling so much, they have like dating sites for them to get wives. But these people are real and they still exist and they still have a role to play. Um, my congregation doesn't subscribe to hate doctrine, doesn't subscribe to, God only wants to save one or two people. It's about, yes, the Hebrew people were just chosen to introduce the world to God and to do justice, not to be better than people. But the thing is, when those people are suppressed and oppressed, the whole world suffers. And so, just like you wouldn't judge all Christians by Westboro Baptist, you should not judge all Hebrew people by guys you may see screaming on the street corner.
Yeah.
The first Hebrew congregation in America was Church of God and Saints in Christ under Prophet William Crowdy. They preached a black Jesus, keeping the feast, and the person who told the founder to start a denomination was an Irish immigrant. Actually, some of their earliest members were whites in upstate New York, who in the 1800s were believing that Jesus and the biblical Hebrews were black, and these were rural white people. Not like liberals in a
Mm.
city, not abolitionists. And before that, the oldest African American church is the First African Church of Savannah. If you go there today, each pew has Paleo Hebrew writing on the end of it. And Jewish people, or even Ethiopians, when they go, they can recognize the writing. And that congregation always kept the Passover during their Easter celebration. It was founded in the 1700s, and my friend Pastor Richardson Kelly is a Messianic Hebrew pastor, and his ancestors helped build that congregation. So this is not a new movement, it's not a cult. there's always been, I've even read documents about after slavery, black pastors preaching in North and South Carolina that, you are the lost tribes of Israel, return to God. So we really have to educate ourselves, because especially if you say you follow the Bible, you have to realize everything in it is true, that the people in it are true. And when you read the condition the people should be in, I mean, you really see those conditions among people of African descent, and even people that have, so-called Latino descent. So for me, it wasn't really a departure. It was more so just continuing to grow. But for me, at the end of the day, the gospel is still essential, but this is just a bigger piece of the gospel.
Thanks for that, because that's really a big reason why I wanted to have you on, was to kind of help audience members who are believers or not believers understand the history, the dimensions of this, because I'm sure there's dimensions. I mean, when I was
Hmm.
doing research for this interview, there's some funky stuff out there. There really
Yep.
is, and but like you said, like there's some funky stuff in every
Hmm.
religion, group, or whatever it is. So it's really important to, identify, like, all right, this is the spectrum. You're gonna get, this
Hmm.
is where it gets kind of like too far. This is where it's the historical context. So thanks so much for sharing all that information. When it comes to and also from audience members who might be wondering or asking, I kind of play like not devil's advocate, but just to kind of press in a little bit. When it comes to the scholarly citations
Hmm.
of the lineage, how far back it goes.
Hmm.
Is this something that is like boom, no discussion, no debate, or is it something that it's like it's ongoing research that as new findings come up, it's more and more confirmed? Where does the scholarly evidence
Hmm.
stand at the state of it at this point, and
Hmm.
from what you're reading? Because it sounds like things are coming back and it's validating
So,
it, but are you happy with the how much is done and invested in that kind of research?
well, there's a lot of books that have been written. If you go to the Schomburg Library in Harlem, there are books that are written on, African Jews, African Hebrews that are, 80 years old, or even a book I found that's $2,000 online called The Blacks Who Died for Jesus, where they're talking about the fact that a lot of those martyrs that were thrown to the lions were actually early African Christians, but people would never think of that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, the scholarship is more so known in the Jewish community.
Okay.
Jewish newspapers like the Jewish Forward, where my friend Sam Castlebaum writes about African Jews, Black American Hebrews, they're always publishing research about this. Because for rabbis, it's like we have to search for these people. When these people start to reappear, it's kind of a clue of the messianic age. But my friend Ronald Dalton Jr. has written about 4 or 5 books called Hebrews to Negroes, like volume 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He's put out documentaries. He also grew up Pentecostals, a messianic Hebrew, and he has even DNA evidence in his books. You have From Babylon to Timbuktu, Chosen People, which was written by a white Jewish man. You have Dr. Dietrich Lang, who is not religious. He's a scholar, a professor out of Germany who spent 25 years in West Africa researching, was not religious, was not looking for anything religious, and, actually came across these lost tribe communities where he did an article, The Yoruba, Lost Tribe of Israel, where if you look at the Yoruba list of kings, you see where it starts from Assyrian kings and then switches over to their current kings. Kind of the proof in the article is that the Yoruba were Hebrews that were in the Assyrian Empire as captives, and you can literally see through their kings proof of this. And Derek Lang is not religious at all, unless he's had some conversion that I don't know about. But he's a scholar, and he has no skin in the game. Like
Yeah.
he's not a white Jewish person. He's not a black Hebrew. He's just like a white German man that you know you know an anthropologist kind of who went all throughout West Africa and is just reporting what he saw.
Yeah.
The Limba were DNA tested. They're a tribe out of Zimbabwe and South Africa. They had to go underground during apartheid and keep Sabbath secret because in South Africa, when Africans would start to keep the Sabbath and keep Torah, um, they would feel like God was telling them to rise up against the colonial powers. And so in the early 1900s, about 300 members of the Church of God and Saints in Christ in South Africa, now they somehow, this American denomination got to South Africa. The leader felt like they should stand up for their rights, and the government killed about 300 of them. And the denomination is about to come out with a documentary. And it was to the point where they told African South Sabbath keepers, you have to register with like the Methodists, the Baptists. You can't be an independent church because
Mm.
for whatever reason, when these people started to keep Torah, they started to get more self-esteem and want to change their plight. And so, the Limba were for years saying we migrated from Israel. We went into Yemen. No, we went from Israel to like Ethiopia to Yemen to we built the great Zimbabwe. We ended up in Zimbabwe and South Africa. We keep all these Torah, traditions. No one believed them. And on the Discovery Channel, people can go on YouTube and type in Limba Lost Tribe of Israel. You'll see the whole
I think
45
I've
minute
seen that
yeah,
a long
it's
time ago though. How old is it? Old? Is it an older one?
it's probably from 2013,
Oh,
but
okay.
it was put on the Discovery Channel. White Jewish man hosted it. No one believed the Limba, and then when the DNA evidence from Oxford University, not from some random DNA company, but from Oxford University, an Indian woman who has no skin in the game, did the DNA. They had the highest marker of the Cohen gene, which is the gene that traces men back to Moses, higher than any
Wow.
group of Jewish men, including white Ashkenazi Jews. And everyone's mouth dropped open, and the leader said, we knew who we were. And it was proven that they did build the great Zimbabwe. So they have, messianic believers, and they have people who, don't believe in Messiah, but they're still going forward. And there are African Americans taking DNA tests and getting back limba. More than one person I know, but these people are literally related to Moses. They're literally Levites.
Wow.
Like, like I've been in the presence of one and I'm like, I want a prayer, I want a blessing. But it's sad because these people are living in poverty and some are dying from AIDS.
Mm-hmm.
And these are like, these are people who have a great blessing that they could probably give even to the church, but they've been forgotten because no one wanted to believe what they said because they were black. So I
Yeah.
have a book list that if people go to propheticwhirlwind.com, if you sign up for my email list, you get a free PDF of articles, books, and documentaries that talk about this subject because for my book, it's being published by the Voices Project, which is connected to Clean College, which is a Christian college. And I have an editor, and everything I put in my book had to be fact checked, and I had to have citations for it. So I'm not just going off, and I trust oral history. I think many times we look down on African history that's passed orally. I do trust oral history, but I know we live in a world where if it's not published,
Yeah.
if it's not peer reviewed, it's not taken seriously. And
Yeah.
so I have a mix of oral history from Africans that, come from these tribes, like the Ga tribe, the Ewe tribe. But then I also have scholarly articles written by people like Dr. Dietrich Lang, who had to have his article peer reviewed. It actually had a lot of rebuttals. It was almost like a professor beef, all these professors writing against his article, then he has to respond, and he's still kind of responding. But
Yeah.
we have to ask ourselves when we see a white Jewish person, we never ask them for proof that they're Jewish because honestly, there's been converts to the Hebrew faith or the Jewish faith for years.
Yeah.
Even when you look at the epistles of Paul, they have this term God-fearers. There were people who were Greek Gentiles who were going to the synagogue just because they wanted to follow the God of Israel. There was the mixed multitude in the Exodus. Those were Egyptians that just said, "I'm out. I'm
Yeah.
going with the Hebrews. Egypt is, tripping right now." So there's all the Ruth. She's one of the few women with her own biblical book. She's a convert. So how come when it comes to an African person or an Indian Jew, because there's Hebrews in India, or the people of Papua New Guinea, or the people of Madagascar, there has to be all of this proof, even when they're practicing the culture, even when they have remnants of the Torah in their possession. One Sabbath keeping tribe in Sudan literally had a family tree paper that was passed down showing they were related to Solomon. But people have to provide all this proof if they're people of color, but we never ask, maybe white Jewish people to provide proof. But there are many converts among, white Jewish people. Some of the most famous rabbinical sages, and I learned this from a white rabbi, were actually converts.
Mm.
But they still said some wise stuff about the Torah. I was shocked at some of the people who were converts, because I'm like, whoa, you dropped some knowledge. It was always meant for the stranger to be able to sojourn with Israel, but the issue is when the stranger wants to push out the actual authentic people. Even in the time of Yeshua, why don't people ever question if he was born as a king of Judah? How come Herod was the king at the time he was born and Joseph and Mary were poor? John, his cousin, was a
Mm.
Levite. How come John wasn't in the temple, but John had to baptize in the wilderness? At the time of Yeshua, you had Edomites, Greeks, Romans, and Herod was not even a Jew or a Hebrew. He was just Greek and Edomite.
Yeah.
You had the Romans placing their leaders over the Hebrew people. And so no one ever one day I was like, well, if Jesus was from the king of Judah, how come he wasn't reigning from Jerusalem? How come his family was broke? Or how come John, a Levite, wasn't in the temple, ministering? How come John had to be like out in the wilderness? We never question these things. And so I would just say for anyone looking into this, don't judge one negative group and say all Hebrews are like that. When you go to Africa, some of those people call themselves Hebrews or they call themselves Jews. They don't preach hate. They're just saying, we're following our culture. We circumcise boys on the 8th day as Ga people, as a Shanti people, as Igbo people, because that's what we always did as a family. When and so even with African Americans, if you go to the Church of God and Saints in Christ on Sabbath, you're going to see the same thing you see in a Black Baptist church. And their earliest followers were white. What did those white people know in the 1800s that we can't accept now? A lot
Yeah.
of times racism really clouds like who we can accept and who we can't accept. You know, um, these Latino children mostly are being held in prisons, and it's like for years undocumented Latino immigrants, like I led an organization who worked on this issue for 4 years. They have been crying out, please pass comprehensive immigration reform, please, families are getting separated, please, please, please. And because no one wanted to listen, because these were undocumented Latino people, now we have kids in prisons.
Yeah. It's almost like which the whole thing of like a family being scattered and then
Mm-hmm.
being brought together. It's almost like one of the deepest themes or threads throughout the Bible of this
Mm-hmm.
where, and it's almost like not so much like we're expanding our family. It's almost like through the promise being given to the Gentiles, but it's almost like we are rediscovering our family,
Mm-hmm.
and that's strikingly amazing and beautiful, but also it can get messy too because the family is very diverse. We talk about the 12
Mm-hmm.
tribes and the variations and descendants and how those things, culture, there's an evolution of some sorts of culture, and how do we take hold on to traditions, and then in this kind of context, and especially for the United States, it's like it's like anti-tradition in some respects.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, trying to replace tradition with consumerism almost, and let that be the new culture, especially
Mm-hmm.
for inner city culture too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when it comes to the average person who's hearing this for the first time, I know from one video I researched, is like if you're a person, if you're African American, is this something that you're suggesting they kind of look back? Is it basically what I'm saying is any African American, are they all some type of connected back there, or is it a subsegment of those from the descendants in Africa, parts of Africa, where they're, how do they connect back, if at all? Like, what would you suggest or
Yeah.
recommend?
So I want to go to the African American question, and I even want to talk about Latinos. So many of the African Americans in America, you can go on slavevoyages.com and you can literally see databases from slave ship rosters, and you can see that most of the slaves had names with Yah in it. So we know, we say God and Lord, but we know in the Hebrew it's it's not God and Lord. It may be Jehovah. Some people say Jehovah. Some people say Yahweh. Some people say Yahuwah. But YAH is like the common theme. Most of those names have YAH in it, and
Mm,
I my mouth dropped. It's gonna Some of them will be in my book, and most of them were taken from the Igbo people, were taken from, and even sometimes it was written Hebo. And some people say that's a corruption of the Igbo. Some people say, they were trying to say the earliest slave narrative books that was written by Olu Equiano. He wrote about being taken as a slave to London, encountering Jews in London, and everything they're doing reminding him of what his people did at home. So yes, as many of the people who are African American, but I won't say everyone. I'm just very leery of saying everyone because different tribes. When you think about Israel, Israel was physically connected to Africa until the Suez Canal was built in 1869. So I like to say, like the Hebrew people, because they became a people in Africa, there was always this reverse exodus, which is when they went from Israel back into Egypt, further into Africa. They're another African tribe among the probably thousands of tribes in Africa. But I think many African Americans have this background, and you can speak to elders in your family. Some slaves pass this on to their children. You can do DNA testing where they show you your tribe and see. Once you get your tribes, you can just research. Like if you get Limba, Google Limba Jews. If you get Igbo or Yoruba, Yoruba Jews. Igbo Jews or Hebrews. Many times, you'll find it under the term Jew because that's a modern accepted term.
yeah.
But I even want to talk about Latinos, because most Yoruba slaves, many were taken to Puerto Rico. So I worked with a Latino pastor, Reverend Wilfredo, who I love dearly, who, he found out he had Yoruba ancestry. And when I went to Puerto Rico, a few months before I went to Ghana, I was like, this feels so African to me.
Mm,
Like just the way everything was, I was like, this feels, familiar. And so many Jews of Spain were expelled to Africa, Portugal, in the Inquisition. So there are even Latino people finding out that they have this relation, because remember it says in Isaiah 11:11, where the people would be scattered, the Middle East and Africa, and Judah to the four corners of the earth. Four corners is not just America, it's a lot of places. And it can get messy because you even have two Hebrew tribes in Africa that don't like each other. I work with people from different tribes that don't
yeah.
like another tribe. And I'm like, oh boy, but then it can also get messy with racism, white supremacy, sometimes white Jews not even wanting to accept Jews from Iraq, or Mizrahi Jews being called the N word in Israel.
Yeah.
And Paula, if someone wants to know what does a Mizrahi Jew look like, looks like Paula Abdul. That's her ethnic group.
Mm,
And when I was growing up in the 80s, she had to have a press conference to tell people I'm not African American because she looks African American, but her people are like really indigenous, Hebrews to the Middle East, but they look African American. So it can get messy, but then that's where Yahshua and his redemption and salvation comes in. And that's why I'm very much like this is important, but becoming born again is the key, because he is who everyone, whether Jewish or Messianic Christian or Messianic Jewish, they always connect the lost tribes coming together with the appearance of the Messiah or the return of the Messiah. He's the one that can unify us in that, that unity, that communion, whether you're a stranger or whether you're a lost sheep returning. you know I think he's what can unite us, but I also think we have to allow the Most High to renew our minds, like the Apostle Paul wrote. You cannot be conformed to this world. So if you think people could not be a part of God's plan for redemption because of their color, because they're black, because they look Latino, because of this and that, you're going to miss it. If you think that poor people can never be used by God, you're going to miss it, because Yahshua said in Matthew 25, what you do to the least of these is what you do to me. The first shall be last and the last shall be first.
Yeah.
Usually, you're going to find the truth of the gospel among the very people that most reject. And God is going to hide it there to test our hearts. If I was someone who was ashamed of Africa and just wanted to assimilate and all of that, I didn't want to be friends with African people that friended me in school and all of this stuff, I would have never been able to walk back into that village where my ancestors were taken from and told will never be seen again. I would never know that, like, wow, I'm not just following the Bible, like, I'm a part of the story. And
Mm.
so I would just say, anyone researching, research into the prophecies about the lost tribes of Israel, and then research what is salvation and what is redemption and what is community. I think my time at Metro Hope help me understand communal salvation, because I don't think I would have been able to get the importance of the lost tribes if I was still stuck in each individual person gets saved and we just each have our own walk with God. That's not true. Your walk and what you do impacts me, and I impact you, because we're a body. We're a family. That's how we should be looking at our faith. Is like, at the end of the day in Revelation, people from all tribes and languages will be worshiping the Most High God. But guess what? Not in one language, not even in Hebrew, but in their own individual tongue.
So, are by that nature, do you feel your do you believe in universal salvation and redemption? What's your, not to get too theological
Yeah.
doctrine wise, but like I'm just curious.
Mm-mm. So, no, unfortunately, I wish I could say that I believed everyone was going to be universally saved. Now, what I believe about, the millennial period, and how I think we think everything is everyone's going to be beamed up to the sky, as opposed to thinking about the new heaven, the new earth, the new Jerusalem, and, the kingdom actually coming to earth. But what I wish I could, but I can't honestly say from the Bible that each and every person, even people who want to reject God and hate and all of that, are going to be universally saved. I can't even say that every person who's a bloodline Hebrew will be universally saved.
Yeah,
Even some people in videos that you Googled and you saw them
yeah, they do.
acting fool,
They say
I
that.
can't
Yeah,
I can't say that even some Hebrews who know they're Hebrews are saved. They just might be people who academically know they're related to the people in the Bible, but that doesn't mean you're saved. So I think everyone has the opportunity through what Yahshua came to do for the Hebrew people. But if you don't take it, I don't know if God's going to force it on you. That's why we have to preach the gospel in all we do. But that's something I'm thinking about. And I know black pastors like Carlton Pearson are universalists, but it's hard for me to look at some of the wickedness that's even
mm,
happening to children right now and
yeah,
just think, you know
yeah.
is God just if God doesn't punish? That's a whole nother podcast,
Yeah, it
brother.
is.
No. But
um,
a
go
lot
ahead.
of my Messianic Hebrew friends have really been talking about salvation and discipleship because this, this knowledge is spreading so quickly that we don't want anyone to think just because you take a DNA test and you turn out limba that you're good. You don't need to submit. You
Yes.
just like, I got my ticket.
Yep, I'm
They're
in.
not going to be testing, they're not going to be checking your ancestry.com paperwork, at the end of the age. And Yeshua's like, you my brother, my
Oh,
blood.
you're in. You made it.
You treated everyone like crap.
Yeah,
Okay. Your limba is not going to work like
that
that.
is pretty funny.
Because some people think that, brother.
Yeah, I believe it. No, I believe it. Cool. To kind of like bring things home and to broaden the discussion as we end is like, you know, I've been like not I've been looking into a lot of Pan Africanism
Hmm.
movements and researching that, and obviously, just like with this, there's a spectrum of that when it comes to
Hmm.
Pan African and that and that movement in the states. Um, and it's been, I'll be honest with you, Only Love, it's been very appealing to me.
Hmm.
Not so much because I've over the years, like I'm Puerto Rican.
Hmm.
I totally understand and acknowledge that as a what was his name, Paul Mooney. He says Puerto Ricans are black folk who can swim.
Yep.
You know, basically that's what they are. That, and I totally acknowledge and recognize that. And over the years, growing up as a PK, there was a void in my Puerto Rican heritage because it was not, I guess you can say, supplanted by a religious culture. So it
Yeah.
was hard for me to appreciate my Puerto Rican history and heritage and culture in that sense. Like I wasn't even allowed to dance growing up. That's how like hardcore
Wow.
we were. Um, but growing up in Camden, New Jersey,
Yeah.
hip hop really was my next thing outside of that, and by that very nature, black culture, African American culture
Hmm.
was like that was my thing. And years later, when I heard of Pan Africanism and what Marcus Garvey, the origins of it before him even, it was very striking to me that, and it made a lot of sense that economic justice and
Hmm.
economic unity trumps political unity. And one of the biggest facts to this is looking at Asians and Asian Americans. They have the lowest political engagement but have the highest education rates. They're actually doing better than white people. And when it
Hmm.
comes to home ownership, education, the average take home salary, and they have also a high rate of economic, investments and development. And we see this in inner city where, Chinese food stores, yeah, fashion stores, a lot of them owned by Asians. And so it kind of like made sense at like a political, intellectual level, but also what I've observed in the inner city. And I'm working in Philly now, and so it's like I see that all over there too. And so
Hmm.
my thing is, has the church has our civil rights, a remnant of the civil rights movement, like missed the boat on putting more emphasis on economic empowerment and leaning towards more a Pan African style or approach and justice work.
So it's funny you say missed the boat because one big thing with Marcus Garvey is he had the ships, and
Yes.
and sadly his own people worked with Hoover, who Hoover had a whole campaign to prevent the rise of a black messiah.
Yeah.
That's when he was, bothering MLK and Malcolm X, and but it all started with Garvey. Now what people need to understand with Garvey, he was a strong Christian. Most of his
Mm.
speeches are littered with biblical,
Wow.
with scripture references. He even has a quote that says, I'm not going to allow the racists within Christianity to separate me from Jesus.
Wow.
I mean, this whole quote, and he's like, I don't care. They actually started the African Orthodox Church from the UNIA. The UNIA to this day has a chaplain. They've always had a chaplain to be, to pray, and a lot of African American Hebrews or African American Jews did the legwork for Marcus Garvey's organization. They wrote the hymn, they wrote the Constitution, Rabbi Wentworth, all of them in Harlem. It was but Marcus Garvey wanted an interfaith movement because he didn't
Yeah,
want, if
exactly.
you
Sure.
put one religion on it, then that separates, other people. So that's why it was in the background. But he was a strong man of faith. I just ask anyone, Google Marcus Garvey and the Bible, Marcus Garvey and Christianity, like his faith, and he felt like he was on a mission. And he was using a lot of the scriptures about the family being gathered back.
Yep.
And I think, he had the largest grassroots black organized group to this day in America.
Yeah, it's
Like
mind-boggling.
even in
It's
the Caribbean. Yeah.
crazy how
And they
much.
were paying no grants. It was all through their money. They even were going to have an event at Madison Square Garden, the future religion of the Negro, to see if the Hebrew faith was where most black people needed to put their focus. And so I do think we've missed the boat. Now, I'm not one of those people that says economics is going to solve everything in the black community, because we had Black Wall Street and it was destroyed. We had, black businesses down south that were just burned up like Rosewood. But I will say that I do think we need to think about Pan Africanism in this time of globalism. I don't believe people of African descent, whether they're in America, Puerto Rico, DR, Haiti, are going to be treated well when Africa is not respected on a
Mm,
global scale. And even the work I'm doing with African Hebrew tribes, I consider it Pan African work. We started a
interesting.
fundraiser for some of the congregations because some people didn't have Bibles, didn't have food. And we called it Operation Joseph because we were sold into slavery, but we're helping our brothers. But among the Igbo and among the Ewe people, there are elders and organizations building places where African Americans can come and retreat and rest. So it's not really charity, it's more an exchange. And
Restoration
I think,
almost.
yeah, and I think we do need to examine that, because for a lot of us people of color who grew up in evangelical Pentecostal backgrounds, it was almost like your culture had to take a back seat.
Hmm.
But a lot of things in your culture, when I start to look at traditional Hebrew culture, even if you read, the Torah, if you read the first 5 books of the Bible, and certain like sacrifices, like a drink offering, and then you look at a libation. And I'm not saying we should do these things, like we don't have a temple.
Yeah.
We don't know if we're Levites or Limbas. I'm not saying people run out and start sacrificing goats when they mess up. But what I'm saying is, we were made to feel like our culture was so evil, but even some of that stuff was from the Bible just before
Mm,
Yeshua. And I think, I am
wow.
looking at a more Pan African view, because actually the church is growing the fastest in Africa. And I think we do need to look outside of the borders of the United States for unity. Malcolm X was going to go to the United Nations at the end of his life.
Yeah.
And I don't think it takes away from your faith, because John 3:16 says he loved all the world. So when our faith is only centered in America, are we really, are we really practicing the faith? And I think more people do need to look into Pan African thought, especially
I do
Marcus
too.
Garvey. There was another man who started the Shrine of the Black Madonna, a black Christian pastor who preached about, he didn't really, it wasn't really called Pan Africanism. They were just preaching about, the reunification and the redemption of a people, but that's also in the Bible. So I do think we need to look at a more Pan African approach. I get very saddened when a lot of the justice work happening in the black and brown community boils down to getting Democrats into office. And I'm not,
Ooh,
you
girl.
know, but
Mm.
I'm not endorsing one party over the other, but even when I look at the immigration advocacy, that I went to my first rally with Metro Hope in like 2008. I almost felt like, immigration reform, was put on the back burner at different times so Dems could get into the office. And the buck just kept getting passed till we got to this point. And
Yeah.
for me, I'm like, families being together, that is a ultimate from me for me over a political party, over you getting reelected, like, or kids that are not with their parents. And for Black and Latino people, we got to really start putting our issues at the forefront. If you're a Latino, it's okay for you to say, my bottom line is these kids are reunited.
Hmm.
Not my bottom line is vote, get this person into office, and maybe the kids will be reunited. You can say, as a Puerto Rican, like, my bottom line politically is for the island to be fixed and not raped in a gentrification process.
Yeah.
It's okay as a Black person to say, my bottom line is that Black women can give birth to kids and not die because there's a crisis with that. My bottom line is, economic justice in my community. We don't have to be co opted into other people's agendas as people of color. I just don't. It's okay to say, as people of color, we want to bring together, Afro Latinos, Nigerians, African Americans, and we want to do some things for ourselves. And I don't think anyone should make us feel guilty or not politically savvy. But what I see now is every time it's like you go for something and it's like immigration reform, police brutality, and you think that's what the main agenda is. And then somehow it turns into, we got to get out votes for so and so.
Yeah, and to be honest, only love, and you've seen this more than any part than me. Um, I've kind of after this past election, I've kind of given up on the Democratic Party. I'm borderline saying I'm almost done with politics.
Mm-hmm.
It's so the bang for your buck is
Mm-hmm.
so high. I'm sorry, low rather,
Mm-hmm.
versus getting a group of people who are conscious,
Mm-hmm.
uniting. I'm in West Philly. I'm working at
Yeah.
UPenn. Um, the people that I'm just getting introduced to in the communities there, like instant, like chemistry, affinity, like when we both realize what's up, and that it's
Yeah.
like the institutions, like especially in higher ed, especially
Yeah.
in West Philly and Philly in general, higher ed is
Yeah.
getting a bad rap with gentrification,
Yeah.
knocking down houses and putting up a new part of the campus up and all that stuff. We're just like I think there's a with all the energy and investment that had in this past election cycle, and we got Trump. It's like wow. It just got me to the point like where I think we got to double down on these things, and not to say to completely drop it, because at the end of the day, like we need policy change.
Yeah.
But I guess our people, we just like there's such an immediate need. It's so we have to grapple with that first. We got to stop the wound, the gaping
Mhm.
wound first, and I think
Mhm.
we got to be more local with our
Yeah.
engagement and politics. And then when we get it based locally, then work our way up. I'm going to be talking to a friend of mine soon, and I'm kicking around an idea of, creating our own. You have these the political zoning
Yeah.
for elections and stuff like that. It's like we should have like almost like a parallel or counter to that by zip code, working with our zip codes, and let it,
Yeah.
I mean, kind of getting a little more strategic with our engagement and stuff like that, because I feel it's not working. And the Pan
Mm.
African lens and that model in the past has yielded more fruit and more impact. Of course, the institutions want to strike that down, and
Yeah.
it has struck it down in every single sense. But man, it's tough for me to even consider,
Yeah.
doing anything else beyond that.
And I feel you because, even now with these upcoming elections, millions of dollars will be dropped in Black and brown organizations. So, and it'll be said for police brutality, this, but it'll be so they turn out the votes. And I know, I know this.
Yeah.
I'm not just speaking from the top of my mind because it's very difficult to get funding just to, do economic work among Black and brown people, or just do, work around mothers giving birth in a healthy way, or
Yep.
just, work where it's like, okay, we're going to just get, supplies and stuff to Puerto Rico. A lot of times it will be that, and, this political work. And many people don't even know that for a lot of these movements and stuff, it's always this undercurrent of voting for a certain party. And, I do think I lived in West Virginia for a summer doing work around urban poverty for Penn State when I was an undergrad and saw the whole what was happening with UPenn. But there's a lot of conscious people in West Philly. And I think, there's things that we can do if we're allowed to just have imagination and
Yeah.
dream without this political process being put on it. Now, I do think voting locally is very helpful and using it as one tool, but not putting all your
Eggs
effort
there. I
in
agree.
deliberation. Because we saw what happened with Katrina. I worked on Hurricane Sandy. Then we see what's happening in Puerto Rico now. So, three times, like, federal government has failed people, mostly of color, who are citizens. And even with Sandy, even some white people who were emergency responders in 9/11, houses didn't get rebuilt for years. And it's like, this woman lost her husband in 9/11 and she's waiting 4 years to get her house rebuilt and they're white. That's a wait. That should be a wake up call. They're not coming to get us.
Uh
So
huh.
it's like, how do we do? I had a Pan African friend, Yao, who for years was doing trainings on preparedness for people of color for
Wow.
years, before Sandy, before Katrina, before Puerto Rico. And I'm like, wow, brother, like, now I see what you're doing. What if we had infrastructure in place where, we would have been able to get supplies to Puerto Rico without having to go through FEMA. Like, we just had a network where
Mm-hmm.
it's like, okay, someone in the diaspora is in trouble. We have our planes. We have, and some people may think, oh, this is wishful thinking. It never works, but it never worked. It did work,
It did
and
work.
it was
Yeah.
always torn down.
Exactly, exactly. When it worked too well, that's when it
Yeah,
got torn down. We see that with the Black Panther Party too. When
yeah.
it
They
gets
started free lunch.
yeah. So I agree 100%. And it's what's interesting about what you're bringing to the table, Only Love, is that it really is a culmination of history, heritage, religion, identity, race, and unity coming on one place of wholeness, and not just wholeness in the natural, like with
Mm-hmm.
healthy families and economics, but also at a spiritual sense too. And
Mm-hmm.
I think there's always been a surge in social justice that rode on a wave of some type of faith element, and we've seen that throughout
Yeah.
history. So I really believe you can't have a true well, you can have a social justice movement, but the ones that tend to have this next level effectiveness
Mm-hmm.
always had some strand of faith and element there. Obviously, there's a humanist arm,
Mm-hmm.
but definitely the religion, the faith elements have been a very powerful factor, and it's really cool on the Christian side of things. When people hear this and hear what you're saying, they can really expand their minds on, like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
Christian in this like larger context, Hebrew descendants, and we're still that story's still going. We can be a
Mm-hmm.
part of that, and that I don't know, but I don't know if you've heard about the research in belonging, but it's a big thing in education where if a student feels like they belong, they're more likely to succeed and persist in education if they're part of the community on campus. I think if African Americans, Latinos, Afro Latinos feel like they belong in this larger
Mm-hmm.
narrative, whew, it could be very
Mm-hmm.
powerful for like
Mm-hmm.
empowerment, self engagement, and those kind of things. So thanks so much for this. How can listeners find you, learn more about you, and all that good stuff about your book?
Thank you so much for having me on. And I would just encourage everyone to research redemption and salvation. And blacks and Latinos definitely belong in this story. I love the UCC saying God is still speaking and prophecy is still unfolding. And if people want to be in touch with me, you can go to propheticwhirlwind.com. And the name of my ministry was actually inspired by the Marcus Garvey speech, Meet Me in the Whirlwind.
Wow.
He goes into redemption, the Bible, so many things in that speech. I'm also on Facebook, Prophetic Whirlwind, uncovering the Black biblical destiny, and on Instagram under Prophetic Whirlwind. and on YouTube under Prophetic Whirlwind, and you can see videos of interviews and worship with Hebrew tribes in Africa. If you want to support any of the congregations, we have Operation Joseph on GoFundMe, where we're going to be supporting about 35 congregations, messianic, non messianic, and individuals who need everything from Bibles to food. And because whatever we do, justice has to be at the forefront. And I would just encourage people to, if you're in the New York City area, August 25th in Harlem at Christ Temple Church, we're going to be having the Hebrews to Negroes, Hebrew Nation Building, a conference where all day long we'll be praying, teaching, and sharing about African Hebrews, and also previewing an exciting documentary that's coming out called Reclaim the Throne about Hebrews in Africa. And so those are some ways you can reach me. We do pray weekly with the sisters on Thursday evening. If you follow me on social media and you're a sister, join us. We, pray in Yeshua's name because prayer is important to me, salvation and just the gospel to me. This is just all about the gospel and the good news. So thank you so much for having me, brother.
Well, thank you so much, and I'll make sure all those things get connected in the show notes, and people can find it there too. Onleilove, I'm sure I would love to do this again sometime, and I really appreciate enlightening us and myself to this whole doorway of God's story, and I'm really blessed to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I was blessed to be here. Thank you, brother.
Have a good one. See ya.
You too.